Today we are going to be going over the broadcast writing rules. It's important that you learn and remember these rules because you will be held responsible for them anytime you write a script for the remainder of your time at KEOM. Also, you should be expecting a quiz over these in the near future. Let's start off by talking about making sure that the announcer knows how to read your script. Now, you will sometimes be writing your own script, but sometimes you may write something that someone else will need to read. First of all, you should underline any words that require a special emphasis, but only use this if it's very important that they stress a certain word. For example, the president's plan now calls for 4 years of service, not 3. Never split or hyphenate phrases from one line into the next in the news copy. If it won't fit together in one line, make sure that you move the entire word or phrase to the next line. This just makes it a little easier to read so they know that they don't have to continue reading on the next line. So look at the examples here. Jack in the box, all in one line. It's harder to read Jack in the box. If you use a difficult to pronounce word, you should use a pronouncer in parentheses after using the exact word. So for example, this says Prime Minister Isa Tui is at the White House. This is the way it's really spelled, and this is the pronouncer. Now, don't use symbols if the word for the symbol should be said aloud. This is in the case of the words like dollar and slash or dash. If you want them to say it out loud, then you need to write it like it's a word. So don't use this way of writing $500. Instead, you need to write the number 500 and the word dollars, just like you would say it out loud. Okay, now on to rules for writing and using numbers in a script. Notice there's a lot of them. First of all, you need to make sure that you round off all numbers except when the number is significant in the story, like if it's a certain death toll or something like that. This is really the case the larger the number gets. For example, you wouldn't say Americans spend $50,264,742 on chocolate this year. Instead, you would say Americans will spend more than $50 billion on chocolate this year. Or maybe about 10,000 Americans play miniature golf each week. Okay, when writing out numbers, you should spell any number up to and including 11. After that, you can just write the numbers. So 0, 1, 2, 3, all the way up to 11 should be written out as words. After that, you can write the numbers 12, 13, and so forth. You should also do this with ordinal numbers. Anything between 0 and 11 should be written out like you would say it, first, second, third, just like you would read them. After that, you can put the TH, the ND, or the ST behind a number. If you want them to say words like thousand, million, billion, you should write those words out as well. For example, you would write 5,000 like this, 10 million, 1,300, 56,000, 98 million, 111 billion. Now for numbers in the low thousands, like 1,500 or 3,500, it's more conversational to say it just like I just did, 1,500, 3,500, instead of 1,500 or 3,500. So in such cases, you should write it out just like you want them to say it. Okay, don't forget to use ST, RD, TH, and ND appropriately after dates, address, and any other unique number reference. Remember, you want to refer to the way they're going to say it. So you would write North 45th Street. You wouldn't just write 45 Street. And you would write November 21st, not just November 21. Okay, when referring to time, you should really follow all the basic rules above in writing out the words, hyphenating, and you should also specify in the morning, evening, or tonight. You are not allowed to use AM or PM on the air. So you would write it like this, 2:15 this morning, not 2:15 AM. You can write noon, 7:45 this evening, 11 tonight, and midnight is how you would say them. Now, when writing out someone's name, make sure that it is relevant, that their name is important to be included. And if you do, they need to go before the name, and they are hyphenated. So, 78-year-old Bob Dole, or 2-month-old Susan Lake. Sometimes the age is not important to the story, like a 36-year-old murder suspect. There's nothing really special about that. However, if it was a 97-year-old murder suspect, that's a little more interesting, so that would make it relevant. So now let's talk about sentence structure. You should always use short, simple, and conversational sentences, and this just makes it easier to read out loud. You don't want to have them to figure out how to include a breath where they need to. It should just be very simple, not run on, and really that's the way we talk as well. Now, we should always use active voice when possible, and that is when it's the subject, verb, and then object in the sentence. For example, the boy hit the ball, and that is the boy is doing the action. The boy hit the ball. And you do not want to use passive voice, and that is where something is being done to the subject. The ball was hit by the boy. Every once in a while, passive voice is acceptable if it's overwhelmingly the focus of the story. For example, President Lincoln was assassinated last night at Ford's Theater. Okay, now using names. When you use someone's name, you should of course use their first and last name the first time you mention it in a story. After that, you should just use their last name, or you could use other creative references. For example, if you talk about Michael Jordan, you would say his name the first time. The next time you might call him the 6-time NBA champion. That's just another way to say his name. Then maybe you just say his last name the third time, and then later on you might even refer to him as the former Chicago Bulls forward. And then of course you could go back to his last name. That just changes it up a little bit. You should never use unfamiliar names or references in the lead of a story. That means right there at the beginning when no one knows what you're talking about yet. Instead, you need to tell who they are. For example, a commerce teacher did something, or a Dallas businessman did something. And then later on, you can introduce them by their name. If you are going to give someone a title or describe them, you should put that in front of their name. For example, instead of Bob Rucker, Associate Professor of Journalism, in broadcast you should say Journalism Professor Bob Rucker. Okay, some people must be shown some proper respect. Most of the time, you do not want to formally call people Mr., Mrs., or Miss, or whatever. But every once in a while, someone does hold a high office, and they deserve respect and acknowledgement of their position. And that would be people like the President, the First Lady, maybe the Prime Minister in England, people like that. And you should put their title in there. So you could call him President Obama or Mr. Obama. You wouldn't want to call him Barack because that's too casual. And Obama just makes it seem like you're not giving him the respect he needs. Okay, when you're using abbreviations, you should make sure that they are well-known abbreviations like FBI, CIA, YWCA, so on and so forth. If it's not commonly known, you should write out what it means before you use the abbreviation. And also remember that if the individual letters of the abbreviation should be pronounced, then you should hyphenate them between each letter. And if it should be said like a word, like NATO and AIDS, then it should be written out without hyphens. Okay, now let's talk about quotes. Usually you do not want to directly quote people in broadcast. You should really just think about what they're talking about and paraphrase it. If for some reason they have a strong or unique, extraordinary comment, then you may want to go ahead and quote them, but it needs to be done like this. President Clinton says, quote, "The terrorists have one day to comply or else," end quote. Again, you normally don't want to do it, but if it's something that really you can't rephrase, then you can use quotes just like shown. A couple of things about grammar. The rules tell us that you should always use present tense verbs when you can, and that just makes the story sound a little more fresh and new. It doesn't sound like it's old news. So an example of a present tense sentence would be, the investigation continues into a fire that has left a mesquite family homeless. So that's looking like it's present tense, as opposed to a fire last night heavily damaged a mesquite family's home. Okay, and also don't forget that contractions are acceptable and actually encouraged in broadcast writing, and that is because they sound more conversational that way. So this example, Munoz's sister Jeanette didn't see the incident happen, but have the same feeling about how it played out. Okay, now let's go over a few grammar reminders. Let's start off by talking about how to use I and me when you're grouping yourself with another person. Remember, you should always say the other person's name first, and then use I or me like you would if the other person wasn't there. For example, I might say, Trent and I went to the football game. I put his name first, and then I decided, would I say I went to the football game or me went to the football game? Since I is correct, I used Trent and I. Another example would be, he gave the ball to Melissa and me. I put Melissa first, and then I decide would I use I or me. He gave the ball to I, or he gave the ball to me. Since me is correct in that sentence, I would use Melissa and me. Okay, now let's talk about subject-verb agreement. Remember, if there are two things as the subject, then your verb needs to be plural. So that's going to be words like I, do, or have. If it's one thing as the subject, then it needs to be a singular verb, like is, does, or has. The biggest thing to remember is that a group is a singular thing. So we would say the students are wonderful because it's plural. The student is wonderful if it's one person. Michael and Michelle are wonderful since it's two people. But KEOM is wonderful. It's a group of people. Now let's talk about the words have and got. Many people use these interchangeably. However, have shows a current possession. That means you have something. Got shows that an action happened. For example, I got the ball means something totally different than I have the ball. I got refers to you physically going and getting the ball. I got the ball, like you went across the street to get it. I have just lets people know that you currently are holding the ball. Now, some people like to use the phrase I've got, and that's usually considered to be acceptable in conversational English. However, KEOM rule, you shouldn't use I've got. Mostly because it could be misunderstood and people might not hear you say the V part of I've and think you're speaking incorrectly. And this is coming from the station manager and the superintendent, so it's just not anything we would question. Okay, talking about pronouns, remember that references to pronouns should be clear. For example, if you said, John and Ted went to the store, he needs to buy bread. You don't know whether you're referring to John or Ted. So in that case, it wouldn't be best to use a pronoun because we would need to be clear on who he is. You would just need to repeat the name again. If you're talking about yourself, then you can use I or me. If you're talking about the station as a whole, you would include yourself in that group because you are a part of the station, so you would use we or us. And pronouns can be used to make things sound a little more personal. For example, your morning commute is looking pretty good. Makes it sound a little more personal for the listener. Okay, and finally, let's talk about repetitive wording. You shouldn't say the same word multiple times really close together within your writing. For example, you wouldn't want to say, right now it's 3:32 and now let's check on the roadways. You don't need to use now so close together twice. You also shouldn't use words that mean similar things close together. For example, right now, it's currently 42 degrees, because right now and currently really mean the same thing.